Hey guys, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with what I think is kind of an exciting video, and it is the books that defined my decade. As you know, we are reaching the end of 2019, and so we are about to enter the 2020s. And this idea just kind of occurred to me the other day because I actually thought what might be an interesting reading challenge for 2020 would be to read maybe the best-selling books of the past decade. And so I've been kind of trying to look up lists that are talking about the really popular books since 2010, what has sold the most. I mean, whether they were published in this decade or not, whether they're still classics, whether they're still Harry Potter, I just thought that would be an interesting list. And I said, what also would be interesting is for me to make a list myself. And so essentially I have 10 books here that I have a very specific memory of reading. So this is not necessarily what I would tell you was the top book of that year, because I have picked a book for each year in the decade from 2010 to 2019. I would not necessarily tell you that this was the top book of that year. And I may not necessarily tell you now that I consider this book to be one of my favorite books of all time. I really went through a reading change probably midway through this decade, because to give you context, 2010, the beginning of the 2010s, I graduated from high school and I entered college in 2010. And that was a really huge transition for me, as I'm sure it was for everybody, but I really loved the high school experience. I had a great high school experience. I really did not want to transition into college. That was a major fear that I had. 2010 was a very tumultuous year for me. And I would say the first few years that I was an undergrad really were challenging. So I read a lot of light stuff. I read a lot of stuff that is very different to what I read now, but the long and short of it is that I think these 10 books defined my decade, and they certainly defined the year that I'm talking about. So this was kind of difficult because I didn't have Goodreads until 2012, but I did not use it as a place to update my reading where I knew that I read a certain book in a certain year for a certain length of days. I didn't use it like that until 2015, it seems like. So I have no data from the early 2010s, and I'm just going based on memory, which is kind of the goal here. I actually wanted to pull books that I just had very strong memories of. So for 2010, this, like I said, was a very tumultuous year. It was full of really epic highs, really epic lows for me. I have, like I said, a very fond memory of my high school experience. And when I think of high school and when I think of the end of high school specifically, I think of the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlaine Harris. Now, I binged all of the books that were out in the Sookie Stackhouse series the year prior, 2009. I binged them over the summer, and I have very visceral memories of that. But 2010 was the first year that I got to see a release of the book. I just found her such a relatable character. I am sure there are major aspects of this series which have not aged well. It started being published, I want to say, in the late 90s, and it didn't release its final book until 2013, and I was there for all of them. And I support the ending of that series. If you have strong feelings about the end of that series, I feel you, but it totally made sense to me. Anyways, that's a discussion for another day. This is a series that is just a relic of my reading years. I don't think I would ever in any way pick up an urban fantasy series today again. That just doesn't appeal to me. And really, urban fantasy outside of the Sookie Stackhouse series didn't even appeal to me at the time when I was reading it. Sookie was a very specific thing that clicked with me. I loved her. I loved Eric Northman. Yes, my original Viking Bay. Love you. I loved Bill. I loved every character in this series. I found it very relatable because it was a southern set series in a small town, and just the experience that she had with people in the town, it was just so authentic to what my experience has been living in the South. And it certainly defined the year 2010 for me. Now 2011 is a year I remember very fondly. 2011 is a year where I picked a book that I studied in school. And so that book was Richard III by William Shakespeare. I could have picked a ton of books for 2011. I really could have picked the Harry Potter series because the final Harry Potter film came out in 2011. That felt to me like the death of childhood. I really recognized it as that when I went to the movie theater. I felt that it was done. And so that's why I guess I feel like 2011 was the year I became less a teenager and more of an adult or a young adult at that time, because I really did feel like a kid until Harry Potter was done. But anyways, my feelings on Harry Potter, we will put those aside. That could have been an option. But ultimately I chose Richard III by Shakespeare because this has changed my life totally. In a similar way to Harry Potter, I think Harry Potter changes you as a child and makes you think magic is around the corner and really makes you fall in love with characters and with reading in a very special way. But Richard III has been a lot of my adult life because in 2011, I finally decided this is it, I'm a history major. I'm not gonna go into communications, which was one of my original majors. I wasn't gonna become an archaeologist, which was another. I was gonna do history and go on to be an archivist, which luckily I actually am. I am an archivist. I chose to do that, I think ultimately after reading this book and reading this play. This was just a really special experience of reading because I actually think, I know a lot of people believe that reading a book in class really takes it down and you don't engage with it in the same way that you would if you were reading it alone. And I agree with that. But I actually think that reading Shakespeare in a class environment is one of the best ways you can read him. I fell in love with Richard III through this play, and Richard III became my favorite historical figure of all time through this play, which might make you question me, and if it does, I don't blame you because this play does not show him in the best of lights. Richard III is the villain of this piece, but he is a villain main character, and you see inside of his head in a way that you don't some of the other characters, and I think you come to sympathize with him to a degree that you don't with a lot of other Shakespeare villains because they are not the main characters of the piece. And I just really felt sorry for him. And of course, it all bore out that he was in fact a terrible character, and he really did kill all of these people, but I was still left with this kind of hollow pity for him, and that led me down the rabbit hole that is the Wars of the Roses. I fell in love with Richard III as a historical figure. Richard III defined this decade for me in a way that the other books on this stack didn't, because Richard III as a figure has taken on such meaning for me personally. In 2012, the year after I read this for the first time, they discovered his body. In 2015, they reinterred him. I watched the funeral online at like 5 o'clock in the morning. I watched the procession of him through Leicester to his final resting place. In 2016, I went to England specifically to see his grave. And so I just feel connected with him, and I don't think that I would had I never read this play, and had I not read this play at a very specific time in my life when I was 18 years old, and I was looking to what my future was going to be. This is really important to me in a very strange way because it's not a play that I revisit very often, but this has taken on special meaning for me. 2012, another weird year. This year can be summed up by A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. And I would still tell you that this is a favorite book of mine. I haven't reread it in a very long time, but this was the best book in the series for me. I binge read this series in 2012, but I had already read A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, the first two books. I had read them a long time before. In fact, I think prior to the show being on. But I didn't care much for the second book, so it took me a long time to ultimately pick this one up, and so I was spoiled for a really big event in this book before I picked it up. If you've watched the show, if you've read it, you know what the event was. It was the Red Wedding. And some people might say that that would have ruined their enjoyment of the experience of reading, but for me, I felt dread on every page in the lead up to that event. And I really appreciate being spoiled for it because I think that it made me enjoy the book far more than if I hadn't seen it coming. And I think that really just would have made me mad and made me want to quit the series, as I know that it did for a lot of people in the early days of its publication. I know Game of Thrones, the television show, has also come to define this decade in terms of pop culture. I have very fond memories of 2012. It's one of my favorite years. And I think a large part of that is due to reading this book that year. Okay, 2013. This book is perhaps my favorite of all time. And you know what it is. It's Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. So I won't stay with this one for a very long time, but this was recommended to me by a friend in college. And it took me a long time to pick it up after her recommendation. And I can't say why. I think I was intimidated by the size. I think I thought that it was going to be slow. And I would tell you, as a first-time reader, if you are, of Juliet Marillier, she is a little bit slow and she is a little bit long-winded. That is something that works for me, and I know that it won't work for every reader, but this was the perfect storm here. I read this over Christmas in 2013, I want to say, and I just have an incredibly fond memory of it. This was one of those books that I couldn't put down. I had to know what was going to happen, which seems really interesting because when you read this book for the first time, I think you feel like not a lot is happening, or not a lot is happening that is connected. And yet it kept me engaged full way through. I love this book. Ultimately, it is one of my favorites of all time, and I highly recommend it to everybody. 2014. This is also a book that I studied in class, and I could just say this author in general and you will know who he is, but it's Dante, Dante's Inferno. This has also ultimately come to define my decade in a wide variety of ways, similar to that of Richard III, in that Dante has become one of my favorite historical figures. And the first place that I ever went in Italy when I was studying abroad, I went to Ravenna, which is where Dante lived after he was exiled from Florence and where he wrote this. And he's also buried there. And that was the first place I went in Italy. I didn't even go to Rome or Florence first, or Venice, which is where I went after I went to Ravenna. But I didn't go to any of those places first. I went to Ravenna because I went to see Dante. That was the most important thing that I could possibly get done when I was in Italy. I felt like if I never come back, I have to see Dante. And I wouldn't feel that way had I not taken this class. Because similarly to Richard III or Shakespeare in general, Dante really benefits from being studied in a class environment because you get a lot out of engagement with the class. I think a lot can be gained from Dante. I think a love of poetry can be gained from him. I think a love of history, a love of Italy, but really just specifically a love of the craft of writing. He is somebody who really appreciated writing, and he's someone who makes me appreciative of being a reader and having the gift of reading. So not only has the Inferno taken a special place in my heart, but Dante as a person has as well. And would I think so fondly of him now had I not taken that class and had I not read this at that specific period in time? I don't think so. That is just a very visceral memory of reading a book that has become incredibly meaningful to me as a person. So 2014 was Dante. Now 2015, I love 2015. This is another of my favorite years. I graduated from undergrad at the end of 2014 in December, and then I started to go to grad school in the August of 2015. I went to Boston for the first time in 2015. I've actually never been back, so I just went to Boston in 2015. This year is defined by a very specific summer reading experience, and that was of Leigh Bardugo's Grisha Trilogy. Yes, it was. I love Leigh Bardugo, and I understand that a lot of people love the Six of Crows duology more than this, and they think that that's far better written. They think that it's just, in general, a better story. I'm not going to argue with that. I do think probably at the end of the day, the Six of Crows duology shows her writing skill better than the Grisha Trilogy does. But I also think that this series does something that is just classic. It's very classic fantasy. And for me, I will always value that in a way more than I will anything that digresses from it. I know people are tired of the chosen one. I know people are tired of love triangles. I know people are tired of hot villains making moves on the heroine. Not me. Give it to me. Give it to me all the time. I love chosen one stories. I love love triangles, and I am not ashamed of it. I love this series. I think it's better than the Six of Crows duology. I know everything is personal, but this series was just a great read. I read all 3 books back to back. It's the first time I can remember crying at a YA series, like actually legitimately getting choked up at the 3rd book. It was emotional. It was really emotional. And it's the first time that I can remember a YA book having that effect on me, where I came to care so much about the characters that I was choked up about their fates in the 3rd book. 2016. This was the year that I studied abroad. So in the fall semester, I went to Copenhagen, Denmark. I was lucky. I got to see 10 European countries while I was there, including Denmark. So Denmark, Sweden, of course. I went across the bridge to Sweden because I lived in Copenhagen. I saw England, Scotland, Belgium, France, Italy, Greece, the Czech Republic, and Austria. I want to say that was all. Everyone says it about their study abroad experience, that it changed their life. It really did change me as a person. I fell in love with travel. I fell in love with the Danish way of life, specifically the book series that I read and that I binged while I was there. It tells you a lot about my interests, and it is my favorite historical fiction series of all time. It's the Last Kingdom series by Bernard Cornwell. I love this series with my whole heart, and I could just reread it tomorrow and feel like I was reading it for the first time. This is a spectacular series. It made me fall in love with Alfred the Great, and in fact, the first place that I ever went when I went studying abroad, I immediately, I got there, I dropped off my bags at my apartment, and I left, and I went to England for 10 days, which was spectacular. That's still possibly my favorite solo trip I have ever taken. The first place that I went there was Winchester. I went to Winchester, England, and Winchester is, to this day, perhaps my favorite place that I have ever been. And I would not have gone had I never read this first book and fell in love with Alfred the Great. I read 2 of these books while I was in England, and I remember just reading, I think it was the 3rd one, where he was going to York, and I was literally on the train from Leicester to York, and he talked about taking that same route back in the 800s, and it was just incredible to me. You know, I just felt a tie to the past. But all of that is tied into this series for me, and when I read this series, I feel like I'm coming home, and I feel like I'm coming to be with my best friend, my greatest friend, Uhtred, son of Uhtred. Love this series, highly recommended. It's immensely readable, it's fun, it's engaging. Maybe it's not the most literary of the books here, and maybe it doesn't have the most merit of all of the books here, but in a way, it's almost the most special because it is tied to a very specific memory for me in a way that some of these other books are not. These other books, I can remember the reading experience. For me, I was experiencing something while reading this, if that makes any sense, which makes it a different experience altogether, in my opinion. Like I said, I love this series, I adore this series, and if he wants to publish 25 more of these books, I will be there every opening day. So 2017, I almost have no direct memory of because I was so incredibly busy. It was my final year of grad school. I was either working, like working a job, or I was working on school stuff. And I was so stressed the majority of that year that reading really took a back seat. But over the summer, I binge read the entire Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare in order to read Lady Midnight and that series, which I also really love. But for this year, I'm going to say The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare, which is her series set in Victorian London. And if you haven't read it, just take a chance. Step outside of your comfort zone and read this series and read it to the end, and you will know true physical pain. Because this series is ultimately about a love triangle. The plot is not the most important thing here. I mean, it goes on, but you don't really care because you care about the love triangle between the three main characters. And it is one of those that just makes you clutch your chest because you are not totally sure who you want her to be with. I was. I loved Jim. I'll tell you, I love Jim. And a lot of other people love Will Herondale. I loved Jim, but you saw the merit of the other person in the triangle, and you saw specifically her struggle with it because Will and Jim are best friends. And it was a really poignant way to do a love triangle. It was really, really painful, which is what I like in a love triangle. I want there to be some pining. I want there to be some pain. I want to feel like she really is forced to make a decision, because in a lot of triangles, you automatically know who she's going to end up with. And you think you know that in the first book. In the second book, you might think it's a different person entirely. This is an incredibly well-crafted trilogy. It's the best thing Cassandra Clare has ever written. It is maybe not her most well-written series. I would say the one that just came out, the Lady Midnight series, is probably her best written. But in terms of character work, which is more important to me than plot anyway, the Infernal Devices does it spectacularly. I sobbed reading this third book. I mean, sometimes you say, I got choked up, I got emotional. I literally sobbed reading the third book. A book has never done me like that before or since. It was spectacular. It was a wonderful reading experience. I adore that series. I know that now a lot of people don't feel like Cassandra Clare is a good writer. They don't really like her series anymore. This is different. Read this series. If you read anything by her, read this series and read it alone. You don't ever have to go back to the real original Mortal Instruments or the newer series, the newer things that are going on in the world. Just read that, and I think you will be satisfied, and I think you will understand what people are talking about when they talk about her readability. 2018. So 2018 was the year I started my Booktube channel, and I think that I had to choose a very specific book that was one of my favorites of the year. That was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I talk about this also all the time, so I won't stay on it very long, but it was also my first experience with Victober, and that's my favorite readathon. It was right when I first started my channel, so I automatically got the chance to interact with other people in the book community. It was really, really exciting. This is also tied to that experience to me, and I also have just a really fun memory of this because my power went out. We experienced a hurricane in October last year and my power went out, and so I read this by flashlight. It was an amazing reading experience because this book is so spooky and eerie, and it's very thrilling. It was the perfect way to read this book in particular. I had to mention The Woman in White here. Sorry, but I did. And then 2019, this is kind of spoiling my end of the year, best of the year videos that are gonna come up, but I had to pick The Count of Monte Cristo. I just did. I read this book over 4 months, I want to say, at least 3. And so I just have a really long memory of it. Not only do I remember it as being a fantastic book and that I just loved it and I would recommend it to anybody, I have a very long memory of it that spans a season. And not every book has that, of course, because most books I read straight way through, and I chose to take breaks with this. I think that was probably the best thing I could have done for The Count of Monte Cristo. I think that that really made the reading experience of it incredibly special. I won't say much more about it here because you've also heard me talk about this ad nauseum this year, but to me, this book defined 2019. And so I think in a few years, I will probably look back on it in a similar way to the rest of the books in this stack as defining my decade. So I entered the decade at 17 and I'm leaving it at 27. That really makes me fearful of the 2020s because when I leave the 2020s, I will be 37. And I have experienced a lot of change in this past decade. I have really changed as a person. I don't think that the me from 2010 would recognize the me now and vice versa. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's good for us all to go through some growth, and I don't think we should ever be the same person that we were in high school for the rest of our lives. You would not want to know me in high school, I can promise you that. But I would really be curious to know what you think the books are that defined your decade. I think this is a really interesting idea, and I just am eager to see what other people have to say about it. So tell me down below the books that you feel really defined the decade of the 2010s for you. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.